So good afternoon, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to moderate this session. My name is Nicolas Zingales. I'm a professor here at FGV. For those who haven't seen me yet, I have the pleasure to moderate this panel also because I'm coordinator of the MyData Brazil Hub, which is an initiative that tries to promote more control over personal data. We organize events, we stimulate discussions about data portability and interoperability, and we are connected to the MyData global movement. So this panel was a proposal submitted on behalf of this hub. And we also thought it was important to discuss the issue of data portability for two reasons. One is that the authority, the Data Protection Authority, NPD, is planning to address with some guidelines, some normatization, the issue of exercise of data subject rights. And so within that, we have a lot of challenges that come from data portability, how to set the standard, something that the law empowers the authority to do. So there's a need for a discussion about what should these standards be, not only technical standards, but how they can interface with individual rights and freedoms, so how we can coordinate opening up data and protecting third parties that might be affected by this data sharing. So this was the first reason. And secondly, there is also a bill being negotiated in Congress that is about regulating ex-ante digital platforms. And as part of this regulation, the authority that will be in charge of implementing the regulation will be empowered to impose interoperability measures across the sector. So it will be involving digital platforms and forcing them to open up potential in certain cases to third parties. So the issue of how to transfer data from one context to another will become particularly important, as we already see today with the Digital Markets Act in Europe. So with all that, we have invited a few experts that come from different perspectives and different regions of the world to enlighten us on this topic. And I will call them to join us on the floor. You see, we have two joining us online. But let me start with the first in-presence speaker, who is Jai Vipra. She's an AI policy researcher with over 8 years of experience in technology policy. She was previously worked at the AI Now Institute, the Center for Governance of AI, VIHI Center for Legal Policy, IT for Change, and the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy. She has a Master of Public Policy from the University of Oxford and is soon to pursue a PhD in Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. Welcome, Jai. Then we will have our colleague, friend, Ian Brown. Dr. Ian Brown is an independent consultant on internet regulation, particularly related to information security and privacy, and pro-competition mechanisms such as interoperability. So he's a regular visiting professor here at FGV, and he was working for a number of institutions, but including the Oxford Internet Institute. He was working for the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and the UK government, among many other accolades. Then the third in-presence speaker that will join us is Paolo Brancher, who is a partner at Matos & Figlio, a specialist in technology, banking, financial services, crypto assets, and innovation issues. He's a distinguished professor at Pontificia Universidade Católica di São Paulo and a graduate and postgraduate professor in business law and technology at the same institution. Also a member of the International Technology Law Association. So welcome, Paolo. Then finally, last but not least, we have joining us online Carolina Maciel. She is a doctor in law at the Universidade Federal of Minas Gerais and University of Michigan, and a master in law at University Federal of Minas Gerais. Regulatory manager and institutional relation manager at UOL PagBank, and commissioner, conselheira, I'm not sure how you translate that, in the association Abranet, Internet Brazilian Association. Then finally, we have Delara Derakashani. She is a director of policy for the Data Transfer Initiative. For those who don't know, it is a nonprofit with a mission to empower individuals by enabling effective data transfers. And well, prior to that, she was policy manager at Meta's Reality Lab, focusing on privacy issues related to wearables, facial recognition, and augmented reality. And she has JD from Catholic University at America's Columbus Law School and BA in Cognitive Science from University of Virginia. So you can see very interesting backgrounds and set of speakers we have with us. Welcome, all of them. So in the interest of advancing with our conversation, the idea is to start from a view of the local initiative, the local discussion related to data portability and interoperability. And in that regard, we have Caroline Maciel, who has solid expertise in the financial sector, where there was a lot of interesting developments over the last couple of years with open banking, now known as open finance. So we'll first hear a few reflection from her about the data portability and interoperability challenges in open finance. Caroline, you have the floor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you all for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you see it.
Yes.
So I would like to apologize not being able to be there in person, but it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk about data portability in the financial sector, and especially the kinds of challenges that we face and the lessons that we learn from them. So when we talk about data portability in the financial sector, we have more than one kind of portability. First, we have salary portability, which is the right of the workers to choose which bank they wish to receive their salary in, regardless of the employer's choice. We also have credit portability, which is the right to transfer credit transaction to another financial institution. So for example, if you have a loan with Bank A and you want to transfer it to Bank B, that offers you better interest rates, you can do a credit portability. We also can talk about meal vouchers portability, which is the right of workers to transfer a meal voucher benefit to a different card than the one that the employer chose. And lastly, we can talk about portability through open finance. Open finance is an ecosystem that enables data sharing between institutions through API integration. So we can also talk about the right of portability within this environment. So I brought some data on each one of them, and firstly, salary portability. We have basically a problem of lack of knowledge. So only 56% of bank population know what it is. This shows us, especially even bank population, which is population that has access to financial services, don't know what salary portability is. And 33% believe that the request must be made in person. that it cannot be made digitally. And 28 believe that their company do not allow salary portability. So we have this first challenge. We also have a challenge of inaccessibility and bureaucracy. We have numbers increasing in salary portability in the last years, but still the approval rate is only 50%. So half of them do not effective the right to portability because the request is denied to be incomplete or some kind of documentation that is lacking. So this shows us how complex and bureaucratic the process is. On credit portability, we have the same challenges as salary portability. So to show some data here, only 6% of banked population has attempted credit portability, and 70% would switch banks if the process was as easy as doing a PIX. So PIX is, for those who doesn't were from another country, PIX is our instant payment choice. So you can transfer money in seconds to another bank account, and we have this solution from central bank. Again, here the approval of credit portability is around 40%. When we talk about meal vouchers portability, we have a different kind of problem here. It's a situation that it's an early stage, so we don't have the regulation by Ministry of Labor. We do have the right on stipulated in law, but it's still under discussion between the private sector and Ministry of Labor. And only in this research that I'm using here, only 22% of workers said that they are interested in meal vouchers portability, showing that they probably don't know what that means, and the lack of effectiveness of meal vouchers portability.
Carolina, sorry if I interrupt. If I may, in the interest of those who are not from Brazil, since you say that many workers also don't know what meal voucher portability is, could you explain what is the meal voucher portability? Because in Brazil, meal voucher is a program that is established to help employers give subsidized meals to workers. And I think outside Brazil, nobody knows about this program. So it would be interesting to give like a quick definition.
Of course. Yeah, basically it's a program that gives part of the salary of the employers in meals. So you have a card with design some money there, so you can use, but you can only use in markets and supermarkets and restaurants. So it's a way that the government historically made to ensure labor rights and to give tax discounts for companies. I don't know if that is it enough, or do you want more?
Thank you. And
details?
The portability issue there is that it's not easy to use them with all employers, right? Or with all.
It's still not. We still don't have portability, actually, to be honest. Currently, it's not possible to request a portability in meal voucher.
Okay, thank you. I think that's enough.
So going through open finance. So open finance, as I said, is this ecosystem that you can share, data share of products and service offered by financial institutions and contracted by customers. So the institutions integrate via APIs, and they can share data in this safe ecosystem to give better conditions for customers. So basically, it's initiative from Central Bank, Brazilian Central Bank. We also have it in the UK and Australia, other countries. And basically, the data here shows how growing this ecosystem is. So now we have big numbers, and we can safely say that open finance can be used to assure portability in the financial sector. And basically, it's not something that it's actually currently working. You cannot right now request portability through open finance, but it's a scenario that is really nearby for us. So basically, to sum up here, I'm probably running out of time. I'm sorry if I took a little bit longer.
My fault.
No, it's okay. Basically, what we need is to simplify the process, because even the portabilities that we already have, the possibility to request is still too complex to use. People are not sure how to request it. When they do request it, they do not get the approval. So simplification. We also have a financial inclusion problem. So we have those that do not have access to financial service, and they need to be included on that. And so Central Bank has an agenda to expand this. And of course, to banked population, we also have to educate them and to make sure that they understand their rights. And lastly, this horizon of data portability through the expansion of open finance would mean a faster, safer, and more transparent ecosystem, and would reduce the risks and the operational costs on data portability. Of course, open finance also has some issues as data quality and cybersecurity, but yeah, this is another discussion. So basically, this is what I prepared for you, and I'm glad. I'll be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Interesting to see these challenges of awareness and security that are emphasized here in a regulated environment. So the open banking, open finance is under the control of the regulator. You can imagine that these issues might be even more prominent in a context where there is no designated regulator for detailing all the interconnection standards like in the banking and financial sector. So, well, now let's hear then from the battlefield of the legal compliance. You know, what does a company have to follow in terms of the law? How can law firms advise in relation to data portability and interoperability? What are the issues that come up? For that, we give the floor to Paulo Branchier.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicola, for the invitation and to be here. Going directly to the questions that you just made, I think that this is a matter that normally is related to competition rather to individual rights. When we see successful use cases of portability and interoperability, it always relates to a situation where you have monopoly or you have the incumbents playing in a specific sector. And then if you want to foster competition, one of the aspects that helps to lower barriers to entry is to give access to user data. So open finance is one of these examples. We have in Brazil the telecom sector that introduced portability a long time ago. We have funds management as well as an example. Each of them in different situations, but connected to regulated sectors. That's the main challenge here, because when we talk about portability, we talk about a specific service. It's not necessarily portability of data as an individual right. So I think one of the main challenges here is how we understand this obligation foreseen in the LGPD and in data protections law throughout the world, if it's not to foster necessarily competition, but to grant a right that is foreseen in law. And just to advance a bit on what Carolina has just mentioned in terms of open finance, I think we can get some examples on the difficulty of trying to connect this unregulated world to a regulated world, depending on the model that the portability is chosen in a specific jurisdiction. So even open finance have different models. We have examples in different countries throughout the world already implementing open finance, but I'll get three specific environments. So in the US, what we can say is it's more a market approach in the sense that portability, given a specific moment back in the section 1033 of the Dodd-Frank Act, has granted a right of portability in the financial sector. But only in 2021, President Biden issued an executive order establishing the obligation to implement effectively portability in that environment. So they are struggling on how to do that, because it was then just as an example of an individual right that had the right to access data from specific financial service providers. We have the European model that is a regulatory approach, and we have the example of PSD2 that introduced different licensing models, bringing new players, and that would only make sense if data could be interchanged between players. But I think that the UK model that Brazil has inspired a lot to implement its open finance, it's not only regulation, but it's regulation plus the technology standard to be used in the portability environment. And that, I think it makes a whole difference, because the regulator is not only worried about enforcing a specific regulation, but trying to develop the ways how the players will interact themselves to create this technological environment to speak the same language and to enable not only incumbents, but also newcomers to provide access to data of their own clients. So it needs to be interesting to all the players that make part of it. But again, the challenge here is always a connection with services, not necessarily through individual rights. I think that when we talk about portability, what we cannot forget here is that it needs to be effective. And to be effective, I think we cannot disconnect with interoperability. If we just say portability, we probably are saying, right of access to a certain data, because you can have it and you can take it to wherever you want, but it doesn't make that sense if you cannot have the technological ways to make it effective. And what we see in examples of portability and interoperability is, I would say, 5 items of an agenda of interoperability that will make sense. One of them is governance. I mean, who should be the decision makers involving interoperability? Because if we only have the government saying what to do, probably you'll not have the engagement of the market and of the players to make it happen in a way. So the example of open finance in Brazil is an example where the government and the players, the market players, participate trying to design how to implement a better environment to exchange data. Scope is another important aspect to consider as well. What should be included in terms of data to be portable and to be interoperable? It cannot be something extremely wide in the sense that you want all data to be included in a portability program, because it makes more complex and sometimes it's not useful. So what type of data should be included? And the scope is very important here. And also another aspect of this agenda would be the players. Who are the players to interconnect or to have their data exchanged? Let me give you an example of a complex situation where we are not talking about a regulated environment. So if we get the tech platforms, social networks, whatever example you have in your head, are we talking about exactly the same products? Can we exchange data in a way that they can be used in a useful way from one platform to another platform? Or it should be limited in a way that you limit the access of data that, you know, has no specific usefulness for the data subject and would be only data to be transferred to another player, and he has only the access to data, but it doesn't turn into an enhancement of the service to be provided. So these are important aspects to consider as well. Technology is another pillar of interoperability. What is the technology to be used? When we talk about open finance, is basically the openness of the APIs and how we standardize the exchange of data through some specific APIs. And that makes sense because it's we have some specific services within the financial sector that are similar throughout players, so it's easy to have the same technological language. But it doesn't mean it's an easy task to do when you are not in a regulated environment. And the last one, which we should not forget, is pricing, because there's a cost to implement interoperability. And in a regulated environment, someone says it's not going to cost anything to the end user, or is going to cost. So we have different examples in different countries. The ones that I mentioned doesn't bring a cost. But there's a cost, and how the market, how the players are going to manage that. So I think that there are some challenges that needs to be discussed, and how in our case our data protection authority will need to reflect in its obligation to develop regulation on portability. Of course, it needs to see different examples, to talk with the society. I think it's going to be a very important moment to bring these to the general public. But I think that if we see the successful examples of portability and interoperability, if you want to have that becoming much more expanded in Brazil, I tend to say that it should not be under a specific regulation of the Data Protection Authority, but I think the Data Protection Authority, through the collaborative arrangements with regulatory agents, enhancing experience and exchanging ways of protecting data subjects, but at the same time, fostering the need to have data portable. I think we could have, you know, other examples other in the financial and the telecom sectors that could bring opportunities of portability, and we can tell us examples open, not only open finance, but open insurance, open health. It always talks about regulated environments when we want to have that effective. So I think these are some of the thoughts that I would like to bring. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo. You raised a number of important points. The question of scope, what kind of data? Do we want also infer data to be subject to portability? The governance mechanism, I think that's a key challenge. The cost, I think some parts, it forms part of the universe of governance, but it's a specific issue that needs to be looked at. When you mentioned the governance strategies, you mentioned the UK as a reference because it's not only regulatory, it doesn't only create a regulatory space, but also fixates the interoperability standard through the API. So in that regard, I think we can now transition to Ian, who has studied in depth the situation in the UK, can tell us if that model has worked and whether the Europeans also with the new legislation are making good use of these insights, and there's something that we can also import into the Latin American context. So basically your takes on this, Ian, will be appreciated.
Thank you. Can you project my slides, please? They're in your Google Drive folder.
Yes, they should be ready.
Perfect. Thanks. I will be brief, and we can circle back around to specific points if people want to cover those. Oh, they've disappeared again.
Yes.
Sorry, I need them to speak from.
De novo, pessoal, por favor. Slides. You can start using the imagination, maybe. Okay.
I go back to it. Right, okay, so I'm going to just touch on 3 areas where the European Union and alongside it the UK, which I'm sure you all know left the EU a few years back, but still has a lot of the same or very similar legislation, has been wrestling with some of these challenges that have these important questions that have been raised so far. So firstly, the Digital Markets Act has just been coming into full application over the last year, got quite a lot of press coverage in Europe, which isn't always the case with technology and competition regulation. So the DMA only applies to the very largest technology platforms. That's the first thing to say. So they're not in traditionally regulated sectors like health and banking, but these are firms that have to be worth over 75 billion euros, have over 45 million EU users, have more than 10,000 business users within the EU. Those are the basic criteria. There are more complex mechanisms for looking at firms that are on the boundary, but those are the basics. The European Commission has designated 7, I believe, so far, global businesses that meet those tests. They're the obvious ones, the GAFAMs, plus Booking, which is a very large Dutch travel platform, and ByteDance behind TikTok, of course. So these obligations, these DMA obligations, only apply to these very, very largest companies. There are some broad platform obligations, which I'm not going to focus on today, but those are things like, for example, Apple is having to allow alternative app stores on iOS and allow iPhone users to download apps directly. And by the way, some of these gatekeepers, as they're called under the DMA, are making these changes worldwide, but some of them, and Apple is a good example, are only letting users within the EU benefit from these. So I'm sorry, Brazilian friends and other Latin American friends, you're not going to get this from Apple in Latin America unless your governments decide to pass something similar. What I'll mention in a little bit more detail here with the DMA, and it comes back to what some of the speakers have already said about the sort of duality of interoperability and data portability. They're almost the same thing looked at from a slightly different angle in some ways, and one supports the other. So there's There is so the DMA obliges designated gatekeeper services like search, like operating systems and so on, to give third parties access to platform features and user data. So one example of that is, you might know, if you have an iPhone, it has a secure chip in, which is used to do secure payments when you tap your iPhone on a card terminal to make a payment. And before the DMA, Apple was very, very reluctant indeed to open up that capability, even to banks, let alone to fintech or other less traditional financial service providers. But that's one example of a feature that Apple is now required to make interoperable. The GDPR had a limited version of data portability in Article 20, but which applied to all data controllers. The DMA for gatekeeper services takes that significantly further and says gatekeepers have to enable real-time data portability. So, you know, I'm just thinking of an example. Say I'm using a search engine that is giving me search results that are based on a profile it's built up of me over time, of the search queries that I've used, of what links I've clicked on. That could be a big advantage to Google, for example, whose search engine has been designated as a gatekeeper. Say a startup search engine wants to let me try their search engine, but make use of my Google profile. If I want to as the user, under the DMA, that's the kind of interoperability that competitor could require. There are some more specific portability requirements in the DMA for specific types of gatekeepers. So one is very focused on search. That says that, again, a competitor of Google is learning a huge amount every day from from the billions and billions of search queries and clicks that are being put into Google worldwide. And it could be difficult for a startup search engine to overcome that advantage, to break into that market without access to some of that information. So for search, the DMA requires search gatekeepers to make anonymized, we could come back to that term if people want to, versions of that click and query data available to its competitors. And then the last example I've given here, App Store's search and social networking service gatekeepers have to give fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory general conditions of access to those services to competitors. And I'll show you an example in a second of what that looks like. Then, very specifically in the DMA, Article 7 of the DMA, there's an interoperability requirement for messaging services. And so far, WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger have been designated. Apple has successfully argued to the European Commission that iMessage should not be designated under the DMA. So far, Apple will not have to do this for iMessage, but Meta for WhatsApp right now, and by September with Facebook Messenger, Meta has to make certain basic functionality of its messaging clients interoperable with competitors. So initially that will mean a competitor service, if it chooses to, its users, if they choose to, can exchange messages with users of WhatsApp and a Facebook Messenger. After 2 years, that has to be extended to support group discussions. And then after a further 2 years, that has to support real-time audio and visual communications between competitors and WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger. So to give you a picture of what this could look like, this is a nice, I think this is just an individual developer. It's not even an SME at this stage. This is called FlipChat, this application. You can download it if you're interested. Effectively, it's an alternative client for WhatsApp. And it helps people learn languages by, the examples, the screenshots up here are, I think, a German user and someone who is learning German and someone who is learning Spanish. What it's showing is they can chat to each other, basically, in which they can send messages and receive messages in whichever language they like, and the person they're talking to. So I say I'm talking to Nico, I'm seeing English in my FlipChat client. Nico is learning Chinese, say. He's seeing what I'm saying to him in Chinese, and he might write his response in Chinese to practice, and it comes back to me in English, and FlipChat handles automatically the translation. So this isn't currently using the DMA interoperability provisions. It's basically hacking WhatsApp. And of course, the risk there is at any time Meta currently is tolerating it. It's small enough that it's not worth Meta's while to try to shut off this client, but Meta could if it wanted to. FlipChat under that circumstance could say, okay, we are going to make use of these DMA provisions, these interoperability provisions to make this client still work. And then a second example, this is Open Vibe. This is a social networking service client that lets you connect to open social networking services currently. That's where the name comes from. So for example, Blue Sky and I think Mastodon and Threads are all on there. So those are open by not through regulation, by a decision of the services providing them. But the interesting thing here is the DMA potentially, so the European Commission after 3 years has to review the DMA, and one thing it has to review is, should the messaging interoperability requirement be extended to social networking services? So you could imagine if the European Commission said it should, and then the European Parliament and Council agreed, then services like this could add Facebook and other gatekeeper social networking services. So that's the Digital Markets Act. We've already heard quite a bit about open banking and open finance, so I'll be very brief on this slide. The UK's open banking regime is quite mature now. It goes back, I think, 7 or 8 years. It came out of partly European legislation, the Payment Services Directive, but also from an order from the UK's Competition Authority. The UK for many decades, in fact, has had a very oligopolistic current account banking sector. The same big banks for many years have held almost all of the UK's population's current accounts. So the UK Competition Authority said, here's an interesting way we could try to open up these accounts and introduce more competition through requiring the banks, as has been said, not just to make their services interoperable, but also to agree a common technology standard set of APIs that would make that easy for a startup just to write some software once, and then they could plug that software into any of the UK banks that are supporting this standard. So unlike the DMA doesn't do that with interoperability. If you're a startup, you might have to write multiple different sets of software to interoperate with different providers. Open banking in the UK has a common standard set, and the only other thing I'll say, the pie chart there, that's based on some research I did with a project with Nico a few years back. This open banking in the UK has led to a lot of innovation in financial services. Hasn't had so much effect on competition per se. The big banks still have all the current accounts, but the different slices of the pie there show you lots of different kinds of services have from small companies have plugged into current accounts and small business banking accounts. Obvious things like budget planners, like helping people with their tax returns, but a lot of other stuff as well. So for example, making it easy for someone to say, the big bank I have my current account with is giving me a really low savings rate on my current account because they can get away with it. So I'm going to have a separate savings account with a higher interest rate, and using open banking every day, that other bank is going to automatically look at my bank balance, my transactions, and say, okay, Ian probably can spare, X £100 and move that into the savings account for a short period of time. If necessary, move it back when I need it for, my mortgage payment or some other kind of regular payment. So that's open banking, and that's being extended in the UK, open finance, but also open mobile, open telecoms. The government, although our government has just changed, actually, the new government has said it will reintroduce the legislation the old government had introduced to broaden open banking out to other sectors. And then finally, the European Union's Data Act, which comes into application next September. This is very focused in particular areas. So one of them is connected devices, as the legislation calls them, Internet of Things, they're often called, that whether that's your toothbrush, your connected light, all kinds of services in the home or in the office. The Data Act sets quite detailed prescriptive standards then for data portability real-time data portability and interoperability for connected devices. And also the EU has a big ongoing program on data spaces in different sectors. So there's a health data space, for example, where some other legislation has just gone through. And the Data Act sets some very specific interoperability provisions and ways that technical standards can be enforced in that sector. So I hope that's given you some interesting ideas about the different ways of implementing portability and interoperability the EU is working with. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian, for a very useful overview across all these initiatives and use cases. I think that's particularly important. The title of this session was Data Interoperability and Portability, so connecting the two, but also busting myths. And very often the myth is, this is not feasible. It's very difficult, but we have seen there are a lot of initiatives that show that it is possible. Of course, there will be some cost involved. And again, we can go back to the governance questions, but this is done quite successfully also in other jurisdictions. In India, they have been pioneers in that, right? With digital public infrastructure that facilitates data sharing, and they also have the same for digital identity and payments. So wanted to hear maybe a little bit of that from Jai, and then other thoughts and reflections that I know you have on compute, interoperability and compute.
Is this working? Yeah. Thank you, Nicolo, and thanks everyone. It has been really nice to listen to the panel so far. Yeah, I have a few thoughts on India, but I also have two major points to make today. I think one on collective data portability rights, which I don't think we've talked about very much yet, and the other on interoperability beyond data portability, so interoperability in computation as well. So I think the individual right to data portability comes from the idea that an individual should not have inordinately high costs to switch the platform that they are operating on. For instance, so if you are a consumer of a financial product that a bank provides, it should not be so difficult for you to switch the provider. All your data should be able to be ported with you so that you can get the same standard of service from another provider. But when you talk about multi-sided markets, there's not just the question of switching your own individual data or your own individual account, but also the question of network effects, where if you are a consumer of Facebook, you want all your friends and family also to move with you if you want to move platforms, and you want their data also to move with them if they want, and you want that to happen seamlessly. So you're talking about both network effects and data. And you're also talking about not just your cost as an individual to switch the platform, but also your competitor, the platform's competitors' cost of acquiring data. So you were very right when you're talking about this being primarily an anti-monopoly measure rather than, springing from rights as such. And the DMA, like you said, solves this in a top-down way, which I think is great in that it says, gatekeeper platforms just have to mandatorily share data with competitors. But there's also a bottom-up way of thinking about this, where people, when they self-organize into certain economic interest groups, might want their data to be collectively ported. And I don't know if Brazil has this right or it is being considered, and Caroline can maybe talk about it later. But I know that there were trade unions in the EU who wanted, who worked for ride-sharing companies, and they wanted to set up their own ride-sharing platform. And the data protection law was not sufficiently enabling of their ability to do that. In fact, it was restricting their ability to do that. And of course, the platform refused to collectively give them data, citing the data protection law. So, the goal of creating competition was really thwarted by this very individualistic idea of data portability. And I think questions like we saw in Brazil, that the lack of knowledge of this being a right is a problem. These can be partially solved because, in fact, why should everyone be aware of this right and, have to exercise it individually? It should be people that they delegate this right to in certain ways who are able to do that. Of course, there are problems with that, and we know that in India, while DPI, there is an idea where you want to create this collective sort of right for data portability. Sometimes that can be exploitative, where you just delegate the right to someone else without actually taking that individual consent from everyone to do it. So you have to think very carefully about what kind of association is given this right, and if they're simply performing the act of consent, or if it is in fact true consent. The second thing I want to talk about, and I will come to some Indian examples maybe in a bit, is interoperability in computation. So we know that computation is important for any sort of digital activity or transaction to take place. And there are people who operate digital public infrastructure in India, for instance, again, in ride sharing, who now say that the problem is not really data at the moment, it is the cost of computation that is the actual cost. So anytime someone books a ride, you do have to pay AWS or whoever that you're using for computation. And so we know that these costs are high because the market for computation is so concentrated at every part of the supply chain. So whether it's data centers, whether it's chip design, whether it's chip sort of putting them all together, whether it's chip manufacturing, all of these have monopolies or at best oligopolies, right? And so it is possible, it hasn't been done yet, but it is possible to have this large scale interoperability at some parts of this value chain for computation, whereby you don't have such concentration in the market, and whereby some of these functions of computation are returned to the public rather than are controlled by a few private actors. And the reason for this concentration, of course, is intellectual property. Sometimes there's bundling of certain products that do not need to be sold together but are sold together. There's, of course, geopolitics, but also there are reasons of economies of scale, whereby the larger you build, the more profitable it is for you to build, and where you also need large upfront investments. And where you have conditions of economies of scale and large upfront investments, you do have to ask the question why these functions are not carried out by the public sector rather than the private sector, right? Because it's, the more you invest, the better it is for you. These companies are now so big that they have, they determine not only the external but also internal policies of certain countries, right? So these questions are, of course, these plans are ambitious, but you can have some easy starts. For instance, NVIDIA has a software development arm called CUDA, which without using CUDA, you can't use NVIDIA's chips, and you can only use CUDA for NVIDIA chips. So, maybe you can have some sort of separation at those layers of computation. There's other layers that you can think about. The other thing I want to add is that the lack of interoperability in computation is not just a problem for national markets. It also makes international markets and geopolitics a zero-sum game. So, for instance, there are United States export controls on advanced AI chips, which they are only able to enforce because every chip that is produced uses some sort of US technology, and because this is a very concentrated market. And you may have seen the recent news where the United States officials said that they would use even more stringent measures against Netherlands and Japan for still continuing to export AI technology to China, for instance. So I think that not just current export controls, but there are plans for, hardware mechanisms where the chips themselves will have, by design, a lack of interoperability so that other people cannot use it without the permission of the United States. So these are plans in development currently. I think now is a good opportunity for other countries at the G20 to promote interoperability and open source development in computation as well, just to avoid a sort of international concentration of power as well as a private sector concentration of power. So in short, I think this is an ambitious but also a worthwhile program.
Thank you very much, Jai. Very interesting concepts. This one about collective portability. It's something I've never heard about, and it's quite fascinating to think about how it could be built. And the second one is about the digital public infrastructure, basically for computing, which is quite important in the AI context. But I think it has some parallels with the costs that are imposed for the data to be really used meaningfully, that are already existing today when you try to transfer from one system to another. So maybe by way of introduction to the concept of portability, we should recall that there are two versions of portability. One is to download in a commonly usable format the data, and the other one is to get a transfer of those data from one controller to the other. And this, for example, in the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, is subject to the proviso when it's technically feasible. In the Brazilian context, there's also this division, but there is no specific requirement of when it's technically feasible. So we need to see how it will be implemented. But I think it generates some of these tensions regarding the cost of not only of those who give the data, but also those who want to acquire it and use it meaningfully. So for that, I think it's a perfect transition to pass to Delara, who has led this project now for a few years on the transfers between companies. So the data transfer initiative is all about that. So we are looking forward to hearing about the details of this initiative. Delara, you have the floor.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. I don't think we could have planned that. This overlaps perfectly with what you were speaking about. My name is Delara Derek-Shani. I'm so grateful to be here today to provide insights from the perspective of DTI. And as you mentioned, our mission is to empower people by building a vibrant ecosystem for simple and secure data transfers. As was just mentioned, data portability can mean different things to different people, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the context. For DTI, during this talk, my focus will be on user-initiated transfers of personal data from one online service to another. One-time operations where a user's data of a particular type is moved directly, for example, a user transferring their playlist from one streaming service to another. We believe at DTI that this is the future of data portability, direct data transfers, and that's why our work focuses on practical solutions to help make implementation in this regard a reality. I think the general takeaway from my presentation is going to be that there is great value in bringing companies together to build a shared set of tools for direct data transfers. DTI finds itself in a position where we are well positioned to convene, educate, and help develop practical solutions for service providers in this ever-changing and uncertain landscape with all of these new regulations around the world, as was touched on earlier. In doing so, our goal is to streamline engagement for companies of all sizes, simplify and standardize data models, help to bridge knowledge gaps between APIs, and reduce overhead, reduce cost for companies related to processes such as authentication. A tiny bit of history for those of you who are not aware of our organization. We originally started out as a consortium of technology companies back in 2008, and back then we were known as the Data Transfer Project, DTP. DTP was essentially an open source code base, and it has supported many of the tools with which some of you might be familiar with today. Tools such as Google's Takeout service, Meta's Transfer Your Information tool, and Apple's data transfer tools. Last year, we revamped as a newly formed nonprofit, and today we are building on that DTP work to build tools that are simpler, faster, more secure. We are not a trade association. We are an independent nonprofit with a mission of social welfare. And we are proudly independent, but we do benefit a great deal from the work that we do with our organization's founding members, who are Google, Apple, and Meta. They provide dedicated engineering and product contributions to help make these tools a reality. Just last week, actually, we're excited to announce the introduction of a new tool that allows users of Google Photos to directly transfer their data to Apple's iCloud Photos, a product that will be available to billions of people around the world. That being said, we are constantly expanding our partnerships, our collaborations to additional players, and always welcome opportunities for partnership. So what are some of the challenges that we are working to overcome before I give you 2 examples of our work? The spirit of the regulations we've discussed today are admirable, but transferring data between services is technically complex. Data may be stored in various formats and structures. Compatibility can be a challenge. If a user wants to export data from one service to another, the structure and other characteristics of data in one system may not be represented the same way in another. And so some level of translation must be done. Facilitating that translation and transfer is the core of our product goals and what we build for. But equally important as our product work is our policy work, where priorities are not only to convene thought leaders, opine on novel questions in this space, but we also serve as a resource and an educator to governments all around the world, as well as the public. And in addition, again, we are constantly looking for opportunities to expand our partnership work with companies of all sizes, as well as civil society, because we recognize that the best collective outcomes when it comes to implementation requires extensive collaboration. So I'd like to talk about a recent initiative by DTI that tackles a very real problem of how to prioritize security and privacy and ensure that there is trust during these direct data transfers. Many of the regulatory frameworks, some of which we've discussed today, do not specify how harm should be mitigated. There are no details or requirements as to how third parties could or should take steps to ensure that a new receiving company is protecting data or that it is a responsible steward. There's no universal method for establishing trust for those involved in a direct transfer process. And therefore, many questions arise. How can the receiving or originating service be confident that data, when transferred, will not introduce security or other risks? How will users be confident that transfers reflect their understanding and their intention? Most importantly, their intention. So in order to protect the interests of end users and service providers, DTI has developed a trust model. And the goal of this is to enable services who are both receiving and sending data to mutually authorize each other for direct transfers. This work, if I'm being honest, was initially inspired by the near-term challenge of facilitating and affecting DMA compliance in Europe, but our broader goal is actually to help grow trust in direct transfers, period, regardless of the nature of the parties or their location. Our work is global, and we believe that this is the future, as users are going to come to expect easily accessible and simple direct transfer tools. And as we've seen today, as regulators increasingly around the world recognize data portability and its benefits to competition, innovation, and user agency. So for this process, we brought together organizations large and small, industry and civil society, to tackle questions of how companies should assess risks and make a determination about whether or not to allow a transfer. So why are we doing this? What are the benefits? Our main goal here is to help guide, structure, and align independent efforts in a way that provides more consistency and harmonization. We believe this approach is preferable to companies independently developing their own mechanisms for a few reasons. It promotes greater neutrality and consistency and fairness in application of review. It requires stakeholder buy-in and acceptance that at the very least, there is some baseline that is required, while also giving individual companies the option to add more requirements if they so choose. It's more efficient. And most importantly, if trust cannot be established, then direct transfer should not and does not take place. I think it's clear to all of us that a lack of trust would be devastating to all of our goals in this space, no matter who the stakeholder. The other initiative I'd love to highlight before I pass it back to you all is something that I love that at least two of the panelists touched on this problem of user education. This initiative, called our Data Portability Map, focuses on transparency and user empowerment, and similar to our other work, it is also open source and available to anyone. And we encourage everyone to visit our website and take a look or contribute. In my personal opinion, one of the most important things we can do, and perhaps arguably has not received enough attention to date, in order to make this system thrive, is to educate users. They need to be equipped with knowledge of what tools exist to them. And so for this reason, we have created what we call a portability map. Essentially, it's just a public repository of help articles with answers to portability use case questions, where we give the users option to provide detailed feedback on use cases, or if they choose, to contribute help articles. I think that hearing feedback from users is incredibly important. Our work at DTI has always been user-centric, user-driven, and it helps us understand what's most important in reality. By gathering these use signals, we can understand where existing offerings may fall short and where additional investments in particular data types or service pairings would be worthwhile. Again, anyone can contribute and learn more about these existing tools. Our website is dtinit.org. But this tool is only in its beginning stages, and we are excited to expand on it and help users and the public. I think out of respect for time, I'm going to stop there and turn it back. And you all, but also happy to answer any questions at any time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Delara, for these practical examples and overview about the DTI. I mean, you pointed to one of the key challenges, in my view, which is how to ensure that data portability is not used as a Trojan horse, basically that can open up to a malicious third party access to a wide range of data. And we saw this, for example, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? It was one of the worst examples. So I guess one of the questions, like for the governance of this in the future, is should it be a private self-governance framework? Should it be public? Should it be a mix? How should it be set up? You mentioned the importance of involving various parties in defining some of the features. I think this is a discussion that we must have. I saw a hand raised. Was it yours, Caroline?
It was actually mine, but it might have been premature. I wasn't sure if that was the question you were posing to the group, or if we were.
It was just a comment. It was just a comment, and guess challenge for the future. But now I wanted to take this last 15 minutes to open it up for questions, see if there's any reactions also to the talks that were made. We'll bring the microphone to you if you have any questions. This is the right moment. Don't be shy. Yes, microphone is coming.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hello.
It was very enlightening. My name is Ine van Zeeland. I've done some empirical research in banks after the introduction of PSD2 in the European Union. And one of the things that I found, well, one of the issues that was very prevalent at first when it came to data protection was that consent under PSD2 didn't mean the same thing as consent under the GDPR, and there was a lot of confusion there at first. And in the end, because it was two different types of consent, one of the issues was that there were not the same requirements for banks or other financial service providers to inform end users of the potential risks of data sharing. So what happened was they would emphasize very much the advantages, like you could get a nice budget app or I don't know what, but they wouldn't tell people about the potential risks, whereas at the same time, there was a huge rise in digital financial fraud. So my question, I guess, to especially the people who are working on the banking sector, how do you make sure that people are informed of those risks as well? And I don't mean just general education, but at the moment that consent is asked or at the moment that is relevant, how do you make sure that service providers also provide that kind of information?
Absolutely. Great question. I think maybe the best position to address this question is Caroline, who has experience in the financial sector, but I'll open it up for everybody. Caroline.
Of course, thank you for the question. First, I would like to say that we had the same problem here in Brazil, that consent in open finance is not the same as consent in our data protection law. Because in data protection law, consent is how you justify your treatment of data. So you can use consent, and you also have other options by the law that you can use to justify your use of data and how you're treating data. In open finance, we always need consent. So that's like basic, is the first step. You need the consent to make sure to share the data. You need the consent of the user. This consent in open finance, it has a time limited period, which make it harder in a certain way than in data protection law, because we don't have that limitation in data protection law. So in 2 years, you have to request it again. And we actually, right now in open finance, we've been discussing how to overlap that time limited, maybe change that. It's a discussion that's been occurring in the council that deliberates on standards for open finance, because it's already hard to get the consent. And we usually sometimes can have a problem of losing consent in time. So that would decrease open finance a little bit. So that said, I say that it's a hard question to know which kind of measures you can use to educate. But first, I would definitely say that you should have a better user experience. I would definitely focus on that. So one of the measures that you can use to make sure that people understand why they are sharing their data, what are the benefits to sharing their data, specifically in open finance, is to improve user experience and make it as simple as possible, accessible in an accessible language. And yeah, I guess I would react like that. I think Paulo wants to complete me.
Also, if I may interject, yesterday we were talking about the importance of highlighting some features, because the users will not read the whole privacy policy. Usually they don't finish it. So a layered privacy note is something that can make the risks more identifiable. I think it's a good move forward.
Thank you. And just to add some of the great explanation brought by Caroline, I think consent is always a challenge, no matter what environment we are talking about, as usual. One of the aspects, I think I have 2 comments. One is that regulation of the central banks is aligned with the general data protection legislation, meaning they made it clear that the open finance environment needs to follow data protection legislation in general. And that helps in terms of bringing transparency, full explanation, so on and so forth. And the other aspect that tries to put a control in terms of the exchange of data within this environment is that the central bank has opened the possibility of exchanging data based on consent, but at the same time, it has a principle of reciprocity, which means that you can only share data with the ones that will also share data with you. It cannot be just one way environment of sending data. It needs to have the participation of the ones that will exchange data between themselves. So it tries to control the environment where this data is shared. So you should not be able to expand that to other environments. So it's a way to try to control where this data is transferred. So just these two comments.
And then two pragmatic follow-ups to that on the European side. So one way the UK with open banking dealt with some of these issues was to say, and it comes back to the regulated versus unregulated sectors, any firm that wants to get access to people's bank account data or initiate payments in the UK scheme has to first be accredited by the Financial Conduct Authority, one of the the regulators for the financial sector. So they had to meet quite high standards for the firm, for the security that they applied to this data and so on. But more broadly speaking, as I'm sure you're entirely aware, but I'll tell everyone else because I think they'll be interested. The European Data Protection Board produced detailed guidance on this, following some of these debates and questions. If you want to look it up, the guidelines are 06/2020 on the interplay of the Second Payment Services Directive and the GDPR version 2.0. And just paragraph 5 in there, I think, very briefly, I think summarizes some of the issues. So first of all of this this new EU digital legislation, one of the starting points is that the GDPR remains in control of personal data processing within this framework. This legislation is not meant to weaken the GDPR, and people implementing the Second Payment Services Directive, and then more recently some of this other legislation, will have to follow the GDPR. So things like the precise purpose of the processing should be specified, applicable legal basis should be named, relevant security requirements laid down in the GDPR must be implemented, the principles of necessity, proportionality, purpose limitation, proportionate data retention periods, and so on. And that's that guidance on PSD2 is quite detailed from the EDPB, and I believe they're producing new guidance on the Digital Markets Act and some of these interoperability provisions. A couple of points that the EDPB expands on in this guidance, which I think are of interest in all of these different areas we've been talking about. There's questions of, in GDPR terms, special category data. Of course, your bank transactions can reveal your trade union membership, a political party membership, if you're paying subscriptions, medical insurance details, dealing with private medical clinics, all sorts of potentially special category data that needs to be dealt with very, very carefully and cautiously in these frameworks. There's the question of what the EDPB called silent party data about other people. So if I say I've made a bank transfer to Nico and I choose to share my information with Paulo's firm, how much of that will cover Nico versus me? That's an important question. And one general principle, of course, in the GDPR and data protection legislation, like it is of data minimization. So if I'm doing, I'm sharing my data with a firm for a very specific purpose, then only give them enough data for that purpose. Don't just hand over, 3 years of a detailed transaction history if that's not remotely needed.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of loose points that need to be addressed. I mean, one question is whether we could have an harmonized framework and, not just have every country addressing these points in a different manner. So also from the perspective of collaboration among Latin American countries, like maybe more discussion around these points, more clarity, more exchange of best practices would be something very useful. You mentioned the part about what is called also network data, so data that involves third parties. I wonder how that would work in the collective portability case. How would you envision the consent being given by the connected parties? I don't know.
Think about this, because it's not, I don't suppose that the questions are necessarily different for individual versus collective in the sense, because you're talking about people who are parties to transactions but who are not part of the collective. So but the rideshare drivers I was talking about, they wanted only the data of the drivers. So, even that is useful. Of course, there are elements where you can divine what the data of the passengers is also, if you are given the data of a lot of drivers. But, that's just a problem with data in general, like big data.
True. And I second also the point that consent is often an issue. And I think here it would be basically the weakest, the system is as strong as its weakest link. And here often it goes down to consent. Because, for example, in the DMA, there is this prohibition on sharing data across services unless you obtain the consent in a sense of the GDPR. Now, of course, this position is strong if the consent provision of the GDPR is enforced effectively. Otherwise, it's basically not very useful. So I think this will raise questions of also about resources, because as Delara was saying, we will have many more transfers, direct transfer of data. So there will be a lot of resources that go into not only making this transfer, but also overseeing how they are occurring and whether they're respecting third-party rights. So I think it's a challenge of resources for authorities as well. So I hope that this discussion is helping in contributing in moving a little bit forward. Yeah, we are already out of time, but I want to say, I mean, this is an endless discussion. There can be many questions that are raised and very little questions, very few that are responded to. But the idea was to show that it is feasible, it is being done. Maybe moving forward, what would be interesting is to have a framework that says, well, you have somebody that can help you to make your portability effective, an intermediary to which you can delegate the power to request the transfers, and that can also serve multiple individuals at the same time, so that you can get collective knowledge about processes and collective movement are facilitated. Currently, we have, just for you to know, there is a bill here that envisions some kind of portability of data for the purpose of commercialization, which is the legislative proposal on the creation of an ecosystem of monetization of data. And this, of course, brings the other challenge about, how you ensure that these data are not going to be just collected more and more to then feed the surveillance capitalism ecosystem and then used potentially in a way that are against the original purpose. So, well, I think we will see how this project move forward, but I think you have provided a lot of interesting insights, you and the remote speakers. I want to thank everybody, thank the audience for participating, and we look forward to continue this conversation with you.